You think you know what happened when Vikings conquered your land? Ships appear on the horizon, axes flash, gold disappears, but nobody talks about the afterward. What happens to the queens, the princesses, the daughters of kings when the smoke clears and the screaming stops? Royal blood means nothing when your throne is made of ash. What becomes of a crown when the head that wore it kneels in chains? Why does the DNA of modern Iceland tell a story no saga dares to speak? Between 793 and 1050, Viking raids rewrote the bloodlines of Europe. But the most valuable cargo walking up those ship ramps wasn't silver or silk, it was women. Specifically, women who carried the legitimacy of conquered kingdoms in their veins. Women whose children could become the bridge between old power and new. Women whose bodies became the currency of empire. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Ben Raffield's slave trade research published in Slavery and Abolition Journal in 2019, and Ahmad ibn Fadlan's Risala eyewitness account from 922, documented in the Uppsala University Viking Phenomenon Project. Now back to the information. DNA doesn't lie. Modern genetic studies of Iceland reveal the brutal mathematics of conquest. 2/3 of Iceland's founding female population carried Gaelic DNA from Ireland and Scotland. 2/3. The reverse was true for men. They were overwhelmingly Nordic. Published research from 2025 shows this pattern wasn't random. It was systematic. It was intentional. It was the engine that drove Viking expansion for 3 centuries. 821, Etar, Ireland. The Annals of Ulster record Vikings carrying off a great number of women into captivity. Not warriors, not treasure, women. The chronicler doesn't mince words. These weren't volunteers. They were cargo. 3,000 people captured in a single attack a century later. The numbers scale with the ambition. The ambition scales with the need. But queens and princesses faced a different calculus than commoners. Royal women weren't just bodies, they were political weapons. Marriage to a conquered princess legitimized Viking rule. It transformed raiders into rulers. It gave their children claims to thrones their fathers had seized by force. The most powerful Vikings understood this. They didn't just want crowns, they wanted bloodlines. Take Odd the Deep-Minded, born around 830 into Norwegian nobility. Married off to Olaf the White, Viking king of Dublin, to cement political alliances. When Olaf died in battle in 874, Odd faced the choice every royal woman knew was coming. Stay and become someone else's political prize, or run. Odd ran smart. She commissioned a Nar, a cargo ship built for Atlantic crossings, secretly constructed in Caithness Forest. She gathered her wealth, her grandchildren, her loyal followers. She sailed to Orkney and married off her granddaughter Groa to the Earl of Orkney, creating new political bonds. Then to the Faroes, where another granddaughter married into the ruling class. Finally to Iceland, where she claimed vast territories and became one of the most powerful landowners in the settlement. She freed her slaves and established herself as a Christian matriarch in a pagan land. But Odd was exceptional because she had resources, connections, and most importantly, time to plan her escape. Most royal women weren't so lucky. The Annals of Ulster provide a glimpse into the routine horror. 821 isn't an outlier, it's Tuesday. Viking fleets returned season after season to the same coastal settlements, perfecting the art of human acquisition. They knew which monasteries housed the daughters of nobles. They knew which royal courts would pay the highest ransoms. They knew which bloodlines were worth preserving. Ransom records from 11th century Iberia show the brutal accounting. In 1026, a man named Octicio paid a blanket of wolfskin and a sword and 1 shirt and 3 scarves and a cow and 3 modios of ground salt to buy back his wife Matilli and daughter Gansina from Viking ships. The itemized list reads like a grocery receipt. Human lives measured in livestock and fabric. But ransom was the lucky outcome. For every woman bought back, dozens more disappeared into the slave markets of Dublin, Hedabai, and Birka. Archaeological evidence from these trading centers tells the story the chronicles won't. Iron shackles found near harbors, scales for weighing silver, ship modifications to transport human cargo, the infrastructure of an industry. Ibn Fadlan's account from 922 gives us the most detailed picture of what happened to captured women in Viking society. Writing as an Arab diplomat among the Rus on the Volga River, he describes the sexual exploitation of slave women as casual, public, transactional. One man will have intercourse with his slave girl while his companion looks on habas, he writes. Royal blood offered no protection from this reality. The worst fate wasn't slavery, it was sacrifice. Ibn Fadlan witnessed the funeral of a Rus chieftain where a slave woman volunteered to die with her master. The ceremony lasted 10 days. The woman was dressed in fine clothes, given alcohol, and paraded through ritual sex with multiple men who each gave her messages for the dead chief. On the final day, she was strangled and stabbed before being burned with the ship. But even Ibn Fadlan questions the nature of this volunteering. The woman was held by 2 other slaves throughout the ceremony. She was given constant alcohol. When the moment came, 6 men held her down, the shields beaten to mask her screams. This was theater, performed consent to disguise murder. For royal women, the stakes were higher because the rewards were greater. A princess could be kept as a concubine, producing children who carried royal bloodlines. She could be married to a lieutenant, cementing his loyalty. She could be traded to other Viking groups, extending networks of alliance and obligation, or she could be sacrificed in spectacular fashion, her royal blood adding prestige to the funeral of a chieftain. The genetic evidence from Iceland shows which option Vikings chose most often: integration through forced marriage and concubinage. The children of these unions carried both Nordic paternal lines and Gaelic maternal lines. They became the founding population of Iceland. Their mixed heritage made them valuable political assets, Nordic enough to command loyalty from other Vikings, Gaelic enough to navigate the complex clan politics of Ireland and Scotland. This pattern repeated across the Viking world. In England, Royal Saxon women were systematically targeted during the Great Heathen Armies campaigns from 865 onwards. In France, Carolingian princesses disappeared into Scandinavian longships. In the eastern routes, Slavic nobility was harvested and trafficked to Byzantine and Islamic markets where their bloodlines commanded premium prices. The scale was industrial. Ben Raffield's research estimates that slaves comprised up to 25% of Scandinavian society during the Viking Age. Not all were royal, but the most valuable were. A princess was worth more than 100 peasants. Her children could claim kingdoms. Her bloodline could legitimize dynasties. Her womb was a weapon of political warfare. Yet Viking queens also wielded unprecedented power when they survived the transition. Women like Thyra of Denmark, honored on more runestones than any other person in Viking Age Denmark, called it Denmark's strength and Denmark's salvation by her husband King Gorm and son Harold Bluetooth. Her influence shaped the formation of the Danish state around 965, or Sigrid the Proud of Sweden, who refused to remarry after her husband Eric the Victorious died around 995. She burned alive 2 suitors, Harold Grenske of Norway and Visivald of the Kievan Rus, when they tried to court her for her lands. She recognized their political calculations and answered with fire. Later, chroniclers called her actions legendary. Her contemporaries called them necessary. The difference between survival and destruction often came down to timing, resources, and ruthlessness. Royal women who adapted quickly to Viking political culture could thrive. Those who clung to the old ways were consumed by them. Archaeological evidence from the Oseberg ship burial in Norway shows how high Viking queens could rise. A woman, possibly a queen, was buried in 834 with the most lavish grave goods ever found from the Viking Age. Fine wooden carvings, textiles, jewelry, even a complete ship. Her grave rivals those of male kings. Her status was unquestioned. But for every Oseberg queen, dozens of royal women vanished into anonymity, their names erased from records, their bloodlines scattered across Scandinavia, their children raised as Vikings with no memory of their mothers. Kingdoms. The genetic legacy persists. Modern studies of Scandinavian populations show significant admixture from the British Isles, Eastern Europe, and the Baltic regions. This isn't the result of peaceful cultural exchange. It's the biological signature of systematic conquest, captivity, and forced integration. The DNA carries the story that chronicles tried to erase. The silence around this topic isn't accidental. Medieval chroniclers were men writing for male audiences about male achievements. The fate of conquered women was considered peripheral to the main story of Viking expansion, but the genetic evidence shows it was central. The acquisition of royal women and their bloodlines was one of the primary drivers of Viking raiding. Modern archaeology is finally filling the gaps. Isotope analysis of human remains shows migration patterns that match the capture and trafficking of women. Dental analysis reveals dietary changes consistent with forced relocation. Burial practices show the gradual integration of foreign religious and cultural elements brought by captured women. The story of Viking conquest isn't just about ships and swords, it's about the systematic harvesting of royal bloodlines to legitimize new political orders. It's about the transformation of queens into concubines, princesses into slaves, and kingdoms into genetic resources. It's about power exercised through the most intimate possible violence, the forced bearing of children who would never know their mothers, true heritage. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, Subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from DNA mapping studies published in 2025 and archaeological evidence from sites like Birka, Dublin, and Hedeby, documented in the Swedish National Heritage Board research. Now back to the information. The evidence hides in plain sight. Every Icelandic family tree that traces back to the settlement period. Every genetic study that maps European migration patterns. Every runestone that mentions a woman's influence. Every grave that holds a foreign princess buried with Viking honors. The biological archaeology of conquest written in chromosomes and isotopes. But the most telling evidence might be what's missing. The gap in the chronicles between Vikings conquered the kingdom and Viking rule was established. The missing names of royal women who vanished into those ships. The absent accounts of what happened during those first years when new kingdoms were being born from the ashes of old ones. Royal women were the bridge between conquest and legitimacy. Their bodies carried the bloodlines that transformed Viking raiders into Viking kings. Their children inherited both the military prowess of their fathers and the political legitimacy of their mothers. This biological alchemy created the hybrid aristocracy that would rule much of Northern Europe for centuries. The genetic studies are clear about the scale. Thousands of royal and noble women from across Europe were integrated into Scandinavian society during the Viking Age, not through marriage alliances or diplomatic agreements, but through capture, coercion, and systematic exploitation. The most valuable cargo the Vikings ever seized wasn't gold or silver, it was genetic sovereignty. Some fought back, some adapted, some thrived, some disappeared entirely. But all of them became part of a massive experiment in political biology that reshaped the genetic and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. Their children became kings and queens, jarls and earls, the founding populations of new societies. The silence around their stories reflects the discomfort of acknowledging how political power really transferred in the medieval world, not through grand battles and heroic conquests, but through the systematic exploitation of women's reproductive capacity. Not through the strength of arms alone, but through the careful cultivation of bloodlines that could claim legitimacy in multiple political systems. This was empire building at its most intimate and most brutal. The transformation of conquest into dynasty through the bodies of conquered women. The creation of new political orders on the foundation of forced genealogy. The alchemy that turned rape into royal blood and captivity into cultural synthesis. Modern Iceland bears the genetic signature of this process. So does England, so does Scotland, Ireland, France, and much of Eastern Europe. The bloodlines of medieval queens and princesses flow through millions of modern Europeans who have no idea their ancestors were once cargo in Viking ships. The chronicles call it the Viking Age. The genetics call it one of the largest forced population transfers in European history. The difference in perspective reveals everything about whose stories get told and whose stories disappear into the gaps between raids and rule. In 2024, researchers at the Swedish National Heritage Board used three-dimensional scanning technology to analyze runestones mentioning Queen Thera of Denmark. They discovered that she was commemorated on more stones than any other individual from the Viking Age, male or female. Her influence exceeded that of famous male rulers like Harald Bluetooth and Canute the Great, but Thera's story represents the exception, not the rule. For every royal woman who gained power in Viking society, dozens more were reduced to anonymous entries in slave market ledgers. For every queen who commanded runestone commemorations, hundreds more vanished into the genetic background of Scandinavian populations. The runestones themselves tell the story in absence as much as presence. They mention free women, occasionally slave women, but rarely the captured royal women who were most valuable to Viking political calculations. These women existed in a liminal space, too important to ignore, too dangerous to commemorate. Recent archaeological excavations at sites like Woodstown in Ireland have uncovered evidence of the infrastructure needed to support large-scale captive operations. Ship repair facilities, holding areas, trading posts. The logistics of turning human beings into political assets required planning, organization, and significant investment. This wasn't opportunistic raiding, it was systematic harvest. The genetic revolution in archaeology is finally making these invisible stories visible. DNA extracted from ancient remains shows movement patterns that match historical accounts of captive taking. Isotope analysis reveals dietary changes that track with forced relocation. Dental modifications show cultural practices maintained by women who preserved their heritage even in captivity. Some of these women became queens, others became sacrifices. Most became mothers of children who would carry mixed bloodlines into the future. All of them were instrumental in creating the hybrid political culture that emerged from Viking expansion. The transformation of royal captives into dynastic mothers represents one of the most successful examples of political biology in European history. Within 3 generations, the children and grandchildren of captured queens were ruling kingdoms across Scandinavia, Britain, and Eastern Europe. Their mixed heritage gave them legitimacy in multiple political systems. This biological alchemy created the political flexibility that allowed Viking-derived kingdoms to survive the transition from raiding to ruling. Half-Gaelic princes could negotiate with Irish clan leaders. Half-Saxon earls could command English loyalty. Half-Slavic jarls could navigate Byzantine politics. The captured royal women provided the genetic key to political adaptation. But the cost of this success was measured in lives destroyed, cultures erased, and bloodlines severed from their original contexts. The genetic legacy of Viking expansion reads like a catalog of conquered kingdoms, each maternal line representing a royal house that fell to Scandinavian expansion. The most chilling aspect isn't the scale of the operation, it's the efficiency. Viking raiders developed systematic methods for identifying, capturing, and integrating royal women that were later adopted by other medieval armies. The techniques pioneered during the Viking Age became standard practice for medieval conquest. In 922, Ahmad ibn Fadlan watched a slave woman die for her master's funeral and wrote, "I saw that the girl did not know what she was doing." His observation reveals the psychological manipulation used to maintain the fiction of consent around systematic exploitation. The ritual performances of choice that disguised the reality of coercion. For royal women, this manipulation was even more sophisticated. Political marriages were presented as diplomatic alliances. Concubinage was framed as honored status. The bearing of children was cast as religious duty. The language of choice obscured the reality of captivity. Yet some royal women found ways to exercise agency within these constraints. They influenced their children's education, preserved cultural knowledge, and maintained networks of loyalty that could be activated when opportunities arose. The most successful adapted to Viking political culture while retaining elements of their original heritage. The children of these unions became the bridge generation that transformed Viking raiding culture into medieval kingdom building. They inherited military traditions from their fathers and diplomatic skills from their mothers. They learned to navigate both Scandinavian and foreign political systems. They became the hybrid aristocracy that ruled much of Northern Europe. Modern genetic studies can trace individual maternal lineages from specific regions to Scandinavian populations. Irish royal houses appear in Icelandic family trees. Scottish clan genetics show up in Norwegian bloodlines. English royal DNA persists in Danish populations. Each connection represents a woman whose life was completely redirected by Viking expansion. The most tragic aspect might be the loss of cultural knowledge these women carried. Royal women were often the most educated members of their societies, literate, politically sophisticated, culturally refined. Their capture represented the loss of libraries, diplomatic networks, and institutional memory that could never be replaced. Some of this knowledge survived through their children. Irish legal traditions influenced Icelandic law. Scottish clan structures shaped Norwegian organization. English administrative practices were adopted by Danish kingdoms. The cultural synthesis was real, but it came at the cost of destroying the original contexts. Archaeological evidence from grave sites shows how thoroughly these cultural transmissions were integrated. A Norwegian burial might contain Irish jewelry, English textiles, and Byzantine coins. The objects tell stories of connected worlds linked through the bodies and bloodlines of captured women. In 2017, DNA analysis of the famous Birka warrior grave in Sweden revealed that the skeleton was female. The find challenged assumptions about Viking gender roles and opened new questions about women's status in Viking society. But it also highlighted how much we still don't know about the thousands of foreign women who were integrated into Scandinavian populations. Recent excavations at Dublin, one of the major Viking slave markets, have uncovered scales, weights, and storage facilities that reveal the industrial scale of human trafficking. Silver hoards found across Scandinavia show the wealth generated by this trade. The Spillings hoard from Gotland contained over 14,000 silver coins, much of it profit from slave trading. The genetic evidence suggests that the systematic capture of royal women continued throughout the entire Viking Age. From the first raids in the late 8th century to the final expeditions in the mid-11th century, Viking fleets consistently returned with high-value female captives who were integrated into Scandinavian society. This 3-century process created a genetic revolution that reshaped European populations. The children of captured queens became the founding mothers and fathers of new nations. Their mixed heritage gave them advantages in the political competitions that defined medieval Europe. Their bloodlines became the foundation of royal houses that endured for centuries. But the human cost was immeasurable. Thousands of royal women were torn from their families, cultures, and kingdoms to serve as genetic resources for Viking expansion. Their stories were erased from chronicles that celebrated their captors. Their names disappeared from records that commemorated their children. The silence around these stories reflects broader patterns in how medieval conquest is remembered and discussed. Military victories are celebrated. Political achievements are commemorated. But the systematic exploitation of women's reproductive capacity that made both possible is relegated to footnotes and margins. Modern archaeology is finally bringing these hidden stories into the light. Every genetic study that maps European migration patterns, every isotope analysis that tracks individual life histories, every dental examination that reveals dietary changes, every grave that yields evidence of cultural mixing, the biological record preserves what the written record erased. The genetic legacy of Viking expansion isn't just academic curiosity. It's family history for millions of modern Europeans. The bloodlines of conquered queens flow through contemporary populations who have no idea their ancestors once ruled kingdoms that were destroyed by Viking raids. In 2009, archaeologists excavating a mass grave in Weymouth, England, discovered the skeletons of 54 young men who had been executed around the year 1000. All showed evidence of being from Scandinavia. All had been decapitated in a single event. The find was interpreted as evidence of English retaliation against Viking raiders, but isotope analysis of the teeth revealed that many had spent their early childhoods in different regions, some in Scandinavia, others in the British Isles, still others in Eastern Europe. These weren't just Viking raiders, they were the children of the hybrid populations created by centuries of systematic captive-taking and forced integration. Their deaths marked the end of the Viking Age, but their mixed bloodlines represented its lasting legacy. The genetic revolution that began with the capture of royal women in the 8th century had created new populations that were neither fully Scandinavian nor fully foreign. They were something entirely new, the hybrid aristocracy of medieval Europe. The Weymouth burial reveals the final irony of Viking expansion. The raiders, who had systematically harvested foreign bloodlines, were themselves destroyed by the political systems their captives had helped create. The children of conquered queens turned the weapons of their fathers against the kingdoms that had enslaved their mothers. The genetic archaeology of conquest continues to reveal new details about this hidden history. Recent studies using ancient DNA have identified specific maternal lineages that moved from Ireland to Iceland, from Scotland to Norway, from England to Denmark. Each lineage represents a woman whose life was completely redirected by Viking expansion. But the most significant finding might be the scale of genetic admixture in Scandinavian populations. The proportion of foreign maternal lineages is so high that it suggests systematic rather than opportunistic captive taking. This wasn't cultural exchange, it was demographic engineering on a massive scale. The royal women who survived this process became the founding mothers of medieval European civilization. Their children inherited kingdoms, established dynasties, and created the political systems that would dominate Europe for centuries. But their stories remain largely untold because the chronicles that recorded Viking achievements were written by men who saw women as resources rather than historical actors. Modern science is finally making these invisible stories visible. Every genetic study adds new details to the hidden history of conquest and captivity. Every archaeological excavation reveals more evidence of the systematic nature of Viking captive taking. Every isotope analysis tracks another individual journey from freedom to captivity to integration. The revolution in archaeological science means we no longer have to rely solely on written sources that systematically excluded women's experiences. The biological record preserves what the textual record erased. The genetic archaeology of conquest reveals the hidden history of how medieval Europe was really built. In the monastery of Saint-Wandrille in Normandy, there's a charter from 911 that mentions a woman named Gisla, described only as daughter of a northern king. No kingdom specified, no genealogy provided, no explanation of how she came to be in Normandy, just a name and a title that hints at royal origins lost to historical memory. The genetic revolution in archaeology is finally making these erased stories visible. The biological record preserves what the textual record systematically erased. The DNA of modern Europeans carries the testimony of their conquered ancestors. The genetic archaeology of Viking expansion reveals how thoroughly the capture and integration of foreign women shaped European development. The most profound revelation might be how central the systematic exploitation of women's reproductive capacity was to the success of Viking expansion. This wasn't a side effect of military conquest, it was one of its primary objectives. The harvesting of foreign bloodlines was essential to transforming raiders into rulers and temporary victories into permanent political control.